So everyone, thanks again for attending. It's a beautiful day outside my window here in Western Oregon. I'm not sure where you are, but it's a nice day, and I appreciate you spending the time inside with us today. Thanks again to our co-sponsors, Hatfield Marine Science Center, Oregon chapter of the Wildlife Society, and the Meyer Memorial Trust for their sponsorship of the Elakha Alliance. So please keep yourself muted. I think that's worked out well. And that's not mooted, but muted. Send questions to John Goodell in the chat room, and we hope to have time for all the questions. And we will take this session to the 55-minute mark. So one of the key questions facing the Elakha Alliance is how areas now dominated by sea urchins can become hospitable to kelp so that kelp can recover. How does the so-called patchiness of kelp and urchin areas affect how kelp survives and thrives? Our next speaker, Josh Smith, is leading the way in answering this question. Josh is a PhD candidate and NSF Graduate Research Fellow at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His research explores species interactions that shape the structure and organization of marine communities, specifically the conditions that determine whether predators or resources drive population and community dynamics. Josh has spent the last 5 years of his dissertation research studying these concepts in kelp forests around Monterey Bay, California, where a large-scale ecosystem shift recently transformed expansive kelp forests to a patchy mosaic of forests interspersed with sea urchin barrens. His research takes advantage of this mosaic as a natural field experiment to explore how sea otters and sea urchin behavior might underpin kelp forest resiliency. So we believe that Josh's research, along with other work on the relationship between kelp forests and sea urchins, will provide valuable insights that will help inform our decisions about restoring sea otters to the Oregon coast. And so we are very pleased to have Josh join us today. Thanks a lot, Josh, and you may share screen.
Great, thank you, Bob.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
Okay. Does that look okay on your end, Bob?
Looks great. Looks great on my end. Thanks so much, Josh.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob, for that introduction. And I'd like to start just by thanking the Elakha Alliance, Bob and John. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. And thank you all for being here to listen. So my talk for the symposium today is going to focus on results from my dissertation research, looking at the scale of patchiness and the distribution of kelp forests in sea urchin barrens here on the central coast of California. But I'm especially going to focus on how sea otters have responded to this widespread urchin outbreak. And I'm also going to describe how the sea otters are helping to maintain the few remnant patches of kelp forest that we have. And so most of the results I'll be showing today come from my dissertation research, but I want to recognize that there are several people who have been involved in this project along the way. And so the results I'll be showing today are really this enormous collaboration between folks at UC Santa Cruz, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and USGS. And I also have an extraordinary team of undergraduates who have spent many long, cold hours underwater and just about equally as many hours in the lab dissecting thousands of sea urchins. And so again, this research is this culminating product of all these individuals and really several years of a project that has unfolded. So I think most people here today can appreciate that kelp is kind of a big deal. It's a big deal because it provides extraordinary productivity and biodiversity. And so one of the kind of classic assessments of this in California was done nearly 50 years ago now. But this study found 130 species of algae and over 800 species of animals in a Southern California kelp forest. And so, this photo here really highlights how biologically diverse these ecosystems are. And this extraordinary productivity and biodiversity is what supports a number of recreational and commercial fisheries here on the California coast. So everything from groundfish to shellfish to kelp itself are harvested in some recreational or commercial form. And here on the central coast of California, we're kind of at this hotspot of biodiversity that supports an ecotourism industry. So people travel from all over the world to go whale watching here, scuba diving and kayaking. And kelp's also a foundational species. So it literally defines the ecosystem. And kelp is what's responsible for that extraordinary diversity that we see in kelp forests. And people have actually benefited from kelp for many centuries. The first indigenous peoples used kelp for tools, things such as fishing line and nets and ropes, and also as a food source and for other cultural and spiritual services. And there's even archaeological evidence that supports this notion of what's called the kelp highway. So the kelp highway is that the first people to the Americas followed the coastline of the Pacific Rim. And like we heard in talks earlier, kelp forests actually span from Alaska all the way to Baja. And so this geographic distribution of kelp provided a readily available resource over a large area. But today, the status of kelp kind of depends on where you are, which we saw in some of the previous talks. And here in California, it's kind of even more explicit. And so I've kind of broadly grouped up California in sort of these three main regions. The first one here is this northern portion of the state. So this is north of San Francisco Bay up to the California-Oregon border. And there's one recent study that came out that actually found a 93% reduction in kelp cover since 2008. And this is perhaps the largest reduction in kelp cover that we've seen across the entire state in any region. In Southern California, over the last few years, there's also been a sort of general trend of kelp decline, but it is not to the extent that we've seen on the north coast of California. And here on the central coast of California, things are really patchy. We have these patches of sea urchin barrens that range in size, and we also have these patches of kelp forest that also range in size. And so my talk today is going to be focusing on these patch dynamics here on the central coast of California. So I've broadly kind of broken up this talk into kind of two key parts. I'm first going to describe the extent of kelp forests and sea urchin barrens here on the central coast. And then I'll talk about some of the causes and the consequences of patchy kelp forests and sea urchin barrens. And then after that, I'm going to dive into talking about the role of sea otters, specifically how they have responded to local sea urchin outbreaks, and also what that means for the persistence of kelp forests. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about kelp forest resiliency, including some signs and some early implications of kelp forest recovery. So the work I'm sharing comes from the southern end of Monterey Bay. And for those of you not familiar with this area, this is a few kilometers of coastline that we chose to study over the last few years, really in detail, to gain insight into the distribution of kelp forests and sea urchin barrens, how they are changing through time, and also what's driving those dynamics. And this is a system, unlike farther north, that's dominated by Macrocystis, the giant kelp. And so historically, the system's been dominated by giant kelp, not bull kelp. And I think this photo here kind of really captures what our study area has looked like prior to the last 6 years or so. So again, giant kelp is the dominant species, but what's really unusual about this particular spot of the coast is that we don't have here a lot of understory kelp species. So the reefs here are primarily covered in foliose red algae. As you move farther south down the coast and to the north, there's other species of understory kelps like Pterogophora and Eisenia. But for this part of the coast that we studied, it's kind of unusual in that we really don't see those. It's mostly giant kelp and then foliose red algae that covers the reefs. So in 2013, we too experienced this sea star epidemic. And like Scott coined earlier, they really melted away. Pycnopodia was a major urchin predator. Here on the Central Coast, we too lost the species. And like Sarah said, in the last couple of years, we have really not seen any individuals. I mean, they are just about entirely absent here.
The first thing I did.
The year after that, we had the blob and the El Nino, which others have coined as the blobino. We're right here on the central coast of California, and so we are very centrally located to both of these climatic events. And so this blob and the El Nino kind of coincided and created this really unusually warm seawater that inhibited the production of kelp. So in our long-term subtidal monitoring surveys, we could actually track the effects of these climatic and biological changes over time. So here's a plot that shows kelp density, the density of Pycnopodia, the sunflower star, and purple sea urchin density over time. And what you'll notice here is that in 2013, you can see right where the sea star wasting disease hit. It seemingly hit overnight, and Pycnopodia were gone. And you can see that our subtidal surveys here pretty much plummeted to zero. The year after is when we had that blob and the El Nino event. And the period after that up to the present time is kind of this new regime of patchy forests interspersed with sea urchin barrens. And so you can see here on the green line that kelp density declined, and there's been this exponential rise in purple sea urchins. So I want to give a few photos here of what this looks like. This is our study area last year, and you can see that there's this kind of patch of a purple sea urchin barren, but surrounding that patch are these otherwise seemingly kind of giant stands of Macrocystis, giant kelp. But there are other kind of more expansive purple sea urchin barrens. This is one location kind of just south of here, and you can see that the rock is just totally covered in purple sea urchins, kind of this image of, I think, what many of us perceive as these really dense sea urchin barrens. And in some of these barrens, I also wanted to put this photo in here, kind because you can see in this photo that this urchin's actually overgrazed the encrusting algae on this rock. And what you're seeing here inside of this box is bare granite. And this is really spooky because real estate in a temperate kelp forest ecosystem is super competitive. The only other time I've ever seen bare rock in a kelp forest is after a storm when a rock might actually get fractured. So that really highlights how these urchins in the barrens are starved out and they are scraping the reefs down to bare granite rock. But here what's really curious is adjacent to these sea urchin barrens, there are these patches of giant kelp forests that are seemingly unchanged. You look at this photo, this is a photo from a patch of kelp adjacent to a sea urchin barren, and you say, wow, if you didn't know that the barrens were there, you'd think this was a pretty healthy kelp forest overall. So in 2017, as part of my dissertation research, I wanted to go out and actually take an assessment of what is the extent of these barrens and kelp forest patches across this area. And so over 3 years, I did these repetitive dive surveys, which you can see as these black dots here on the map. This area in gray is land, and this is the ocean over here. So I did these repetitive dives over the course of 3 years to look at the extent of barrens and forests and how they were changing through time. And so next here, I'm going to show a map of the distribution of sea urchins across the study area. So on this map here, this is a map of urchin density. The areas that are in this kind of bright purple pink color represent areas where there's a ton of urchins. And then the blue areas here are areas that have very low urchin density. And in some places, there were no urchins at all. And then this kind of tan bit here is land. So from this kind of initial map, it's pretty easy to see here how there are kind of these small areas where there's a lot of urchins. Directly adjacent to those are reefs that don't have many urchins at all. And so there's kind of these patches that vary in their spatial extent. So I'm going to move this map to the side here because I want to show how urchin density relates to kelp density. So this is a map of the same area here. The areas in green are areas where there's a lot of kelp, and the areas in yellow are areas where there's no kelp. And so when we compare these maps side by side, we can kind of map out where the barrens and the kelp forests are. So you'll see here, if I draw boxes around the same location, you'll see that there are areas with a lot of urchins. Those places don't have any kelp. And here's an actual photo of that location. It's a sea urchin barren. But literally tens of meters away, there are these patches where there are hardly any urchins at all. There's a lot of kelp, and here's a photo of what that area actually looks like. It seems like a otherwise seemingly healthy patch of kelp forest. So the final dimension I want to show here is how urchin density and kelp density relates to urchin health. So earlier we heard Scott talk about urchin condition and their gonad condition, or what we call their gonad index. And you'll see that in places where there's not a lot of urchins, there's a lot of kelp, and those urchins are eating that kelp and reinvesting all of that energy into the production of gonads. But in adjacent areas that are sea urchin barrens, there's no kelp, and these urchins are just totally starved out. And so these are photos of urchins that we dissected in the lab. And this is a real photo of an urchin that we opened up. We didn't scoop anything out of it. It's empty. And it's really remarkable how urchins can persist in this starved state for really extended periods of time. Okay, so just to kind of reiterate what the scale of patchiness in this region looks like. I have a colleague at Stanford who is using drones to survey kelp in this area. And so I wanted to show a quick video here of the surface where you can see kelp canopy and you can kind of imagine where these barrens and forests are at. So this video is going to kind of pan around to the right here when I play it. But just to give some perspective, right now, we're overlooking Hopkins Marine Station, which is right in the middle of our study area. And so this is looking south. This whole area over here is kind of an urchin barren, which I just showed in the map. So I'm going to play the video here, and it's going to kind of pan around to the right. And I'm going to pause it here in just a moment to kind of point out where the kelp's at. So I'm going to pause it right here. Now we're looking right out straight from Hopkins Marine Station. On the left right here is a sea urchin barren. And then you can kind of start to see the top of giant kelp reaching the surface. And so that's right here where I'm circling with my cursor. So I'm going to continue to play this. It's going to pan around to the right. And so now we're looking towards the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Again, you can kind of see a little bit of kelp on the surface here. And then if you look real carefully off in the distance, there's no more kelp at the surface. And so this is just kind of a bird's eye view of what it looks like at the surface. But again, this is exactly where those maps were that I just showed. And so you can really see kind of how these barrens are really patchy over kind of a relatively small geographic area. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some of the causes and consequences of these patchy kelp forests and sea urchin barrens. And I want to specifically draw attention to sea urchin behavior. There's really kind of two fundamentally different tactics that urchins use for grazing. In patches of kelp forests, the urchins are predominantly living down in cracks and crevices, and they are consuming drift kelp that's raining down from above and kind of drifting across the reef. And then that drift kelp gets deposited in these cracks and crevices where the urchins eat that drift algae. And we call that passive sea urchin grazing. But when the drift algae becomes scarce, those urchins undergo a fundamental transformation in their behavior, where they literally shift from passive grazing and they emerge out of their crevices, they storm around the reef, and we call that active grazing. So when urchins shift to this active grazing behavior, that is when we actually see this transformation from kelp forest to sea urchin barrens. And so as part of our surveys, we actually measured these two different types of sea urchin grazing. We measured passive grazing urchins when we were out in the field by looking in cracks and crevices and turning over rocks to really try to get a good count of the number of urchins that are doing this type of passive grazing behavior. But then we also measured actively grazing urchins by using photo plots. So we took pictures of the reef, and then in the lab, we were able to count the number of urchins that were out on the reef actively grazing. And so here's a plot where I'm showing the proportion of urchins that were actively grazing as a function of kelp density. And you can see that there's kind of this really tight relationship here. We call this a threshold relationship. If we draw boxes here, you can pretty much see where the barrens are and where the forests are at. So in a kelp forest where kelp is greater than about 1 stipe density per meter squared, we never really see more than 20% of the urchins there out on the reef. But when kelp is less than 1 stipe per meter squared, it's like, here they come, here's all the urchins, and you can see there's this huge cluster of points where well over half of the urchins there are out on the reef. They are not down in the crevices. So this behavior, these two types of behavior, passive and active grazing, have fundamental consequences for urchin health. So there's a little bit of overlap here with Scott's talk earlier, but you can see that healthy urchins are those that are passively grazing in forests. And here's a photo of what the marketable product actually looks like. But in barrens, these starved urchins are the ones that are active grazing. And so I draw attention to this because the starved active grazing modality that urchins can employ has fundamental consequences for their economic profitability, and there's also ecological consequences. So farther north of here, on the north coast of California, there's been limited approval for urchin culling to enhance kelp forest restoration, and commercial urchin divers are literally bringing up buckets and harvest bins full of urchins that have no commercial value. And there's also these community-wide consequences. So active grazing sea urchins mow down kelp forests, and other species that depend on kelp for survival also perish. Okay, so far I've covered what patchy forests of barrens and forests and barrens look like here on the central coast of California, and importantly, how the foraging behavior of urchins translates to their gonad condition or their health. So now I'm going to dive into talking about the role of sea otters in maintaining these patches of kelp forest that we have. So I want to start this section by recognizing that here northward into Alaska, there's traditionally been some combination of sea urchins and urchin predators. Between California and Washington, there's really two kind of focal species of sea urchins, the purple urchin and the red urchin. And then, like I said, there's also kind of these combinations of predators. But here on the central coast of California, like in other places, we lost Pycnopodia, and we don't really have wolf eel in high abundance. Wolf eel are known sea urchin predators, but we don't really have very many of them here. So that really leaves kind of three key players in the system. We have purple urchins, which are the species primarily responsible for kelp deforestation. And then we have purple urchin predators, which are the rock crab and sea otters. And our lab's been doing a lot of research looking at the role of rock crabs. But for this talk, I'm specifically going to talk about the role of sea otters. And so again, there's kind of two parts here. I want to talk about how otters have responded to this widespread urchin outbreak, but then also what they're doing in order to maintain the current patches of kelp forest that we have. So in 2017, we launched a study where we went out and we combined these spatially explicit observations of sea otter foraging behavior with dive surveys at the locations where they were eating to determine what that environment looked like, and then also laboratory dissections of urchins to see the quality or condition of urchins that otters were foraging on. And I want to give a little bit of background about otter trends in this region. So this is a time series here that shows otter abundance at a few key focal places in California. And you'll notice that here on the Central Coast, otter abundance has always been greater than other places in the state. But in the last few years, you'll notice that there's also been this spike in otter abundance. So over the past several years, a team from USGS and the Monterey Bay Aquarium have been tracking what sea otters are eating and where they are foraging as part of these long-term sea otter diet surveys. And they do this by walking the coastline and tracking otters with telescopes, rangefinders, and GPS units. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to then look at sea otter diets over time, and specifically look at how sea otter diets, or what sea otter diets rather, tell us about how they've responded to the urchin outbreak. So this is a plot here that shows the proportion of urchins in sea otter diets across the population in this area. And so all I'm showing here is a before and after the urchin outbreak. So what this plot here is showing is that at the population level, before the urchin outbreak, otter diets were comprised of around 8 to 10% urchin prey. But then after the urchin outbreak, that number literally doubled, upwards of around 18 to 20%. So otters have clearly responded to the increase in available prey, prey being urchins, by increasing their urchin consumption. But one really key part of this story is where the otters are eating urchins. So I showed these maps earlier of the distribution of where the urchins are at, what the kelp density looks like, and also what sea urchin gonad condition is like across the area. But now I'm overlaying these points where sea otters made repetitive dives for urchin prey. So each black dot here is a place where an otter made 3 or more dives for urchins, and we call this a focal patch. It's an area that we consider to be non-random. The otter clearly is interested in that patch of urchins for some reason. And what you'll see here from where these points lie is that they are areas where urchin density is low, kelp density is high, and the urchin gonad condition is also really high, meaning otters are preferentially choosing these healthy urchins in patches of forests, and they're mostly ignoring those in sea urchin barrens. And so what this means is that otter preference for high quality, energetically profitable urchins in patches of forests really underpins patch resistance to overgrazing. In other words, otters are helping to maintain these patches of kelp forests that we have. And so when we kind of think about what the future might look like, it's pretty clear at the present time, otters are not foraging on urchins in patches of barrens. However, because otters are doing this really focused, intense foraging in patches of forests, what that means is that eventually, if something takes out the urchins in the barrens, it could be, for example, a large winter storm, or it could be an urchin disease. The fact that otters are foraging nearby in kelp forests and helping to maintain those forests means that there's source populations of kelp nearby. So when those urchins in the barren patches ultimately experience some source of mortality, there's kelp nearby that can help replenish those once barren grounds. Okay, so I just described the role of sea otters in helping to maintain the resistance of patches to overgrazing by sea urchins. Now I'm going to talk about some early signs of kelp forest recovery that we've just recently documented here on the Central Coast. So this is an area that it's part of our study region. It's called Point Pinos. It's kind of near the outer edge of our study area. And in 2017, we first surveyed the site. You can see that at that time, it was a total expansive sea urchin barren. I mean, there's no kelp. The urchins had grazed the reef all the way down to where the reef became expansive sand. We went back and surveyed this area again in 2018 and in 2019. But when we went back in 2019, it looked like this. And so there's really kind of two things going on here. The most obvious one is that, hey, kelp recovered in an area that was just a sea urchin barren 2 years prior. But the other thing is that notice the species of kelp that recovered. It was not giant kelp. In fact, it was bull kelp. And this is one of the first times that we've seen expansive bull kelp in many years at this location. And so I'll describe here in a moment why that part about bull kelp recolonizing this area is particularly interesting. But I wanted to show kind of a closer look at this area. So I want to draw your attention to what's going on inside of this box right here. So in 2017, notice how this box is really red. This indicates that there were a lot of urchins. Here's an actual photo plot of that area. And you can see that it's urchins everywhere. They filled up the entire sampling quadrat here. But then in 2018, it kind of starts to cool off a little bit. Inside of this box, it's not as red. There's a little bit more blue, and you can see in the photo here that there's clearly not as many urchins. And then in 2019, notice that box has completely cooled off, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, here it is, bull kelp has recovered in this area that was once a sea urchin barren. But notice just kind of inshore from this box here, look how red it is. So it's like, whoa, there's all these urchins inshore from that box or those deeper areas. And so one thought we had was, well, did urchins just move? Did they move from those deep reefs into the shallow zone? And so we have size data for urchins where we actually looked at this question. And so I'm going to show a plot here that kind of has a few different dimensions. What I'm going to show is the density of large and medium-sized urchins over 3 years and across the 3 depth zones. So again, the hypothesis was that urchins moved from this deep zone up into the shallow zone, and when they did that, kelp recovered in this deep area. So taking a look at the deep zone first, notice that between 2017 and 2018, again, this is urchin density, there was really not much change. But between 2018 and 2019, at this deep location, it was like, whoa, the large urchins, notice the blue color here, they're gone. And so we saw this huge reduction that year in the density of large and medium-sized purple sea urchins. At the mid-depth zone, we saw a similar trend. So again, between 2017 and 2018, not much going on. But then between 2018 and 2019, huge reduction in urchin density. And then what we saw in the shallow zone was kind of what we thought was going on. So you'll notice that between 2018 and 19, there was this huge spike in urchin density. And importantly, the spike in density was not small urchins, it was big urchins. And so kind of looking at these trends here, sort of the most parsimonious or straightforward explanation is that the urchins literally moved up into the shallow area. And when they did that, kelp recovered in those areas that they moved from. Now there are some kind of other things that may be going on. Could it have been predation? Perhaps, but when we look at our sea otter diet surveys, we did not see otters foraging on urchins in this location. So it's unlikely that urchins experienced any source of mortality here due to predation. And we also didn't see any signs of urchin disease here. So it kind of lends the interpretation that urchins moved up into the shallow zone. And again, when they did that, the first species to recover was bull kelp. And so this is kind of an exciting photo here. This photo was taken just last weekend. And you can see that there's Nereo, bull kelp, but if you look carefully, you'll see at the surface that there is expansive macrocystis canopy covering the surface. And so there's kind of been some work done in the past looking at kelp competition between giant kelp and bull kelp. And the work that's been done has shown that giant kelp actually provides this kind of blanket of shade on the reef, which makes it really tough for bull kelp to persist. So kind of what we think is going on here is that kind of going back to the beginning, there once was an old growth kind of dominant giant kelp forest that was then overgrazed by sea urchins. Those urchins then moved up into the shallow zone. And when they did that, there was kind of this blank slate in the deeper reefs. And because Nereocystis, the bull kelp, is an annual, it was the first to just, bam, it colonized that area right away, grew quickly. And now we're starting to see that Nereocystis bull kelp forest become interspersed with giant kelp once again. Okay, so to recap, I covered the kind of the extent of barrens and forests around this region here on the central coast of California, including some of the causes and the consequences, particularly with respect to sea urchin behavior and their gonad condition. And then I talked about the role of sea otters in maintaining these patches of forest that we have, including some early signs of kelp forest recovery. So there's really kind of three key take-homes here. The first is that when you lose kelp and you lose Pycnopodia, which was a mesopredator of purple sea urchins, urchins undergo a fundamental shift. They no longer have one of their predators and food is limited, so they come out of their crevices and they start actively grazing reefs. When they do that, they experience a fundamental decline in their gonad condition. And so when you have this patchy mosaic of barrens and kelp forests where urchins are healthy in forests and starved out in barrens, the sea otters literally have a choice. And so the otters responded to this mosaic of barrens and forests by preferentially going to areas where the urchins are really healthy in forests and then targeting those urchins. And these factors underpin the persistence of kelp forests here on the central coast of California. Okay, so with that, I would like to once again thank the Elakha Alliance for inviting me and to thank all the collaborators and funding sources who have really made this research possible. So hopefully I have a little bit of time for questions after all that.
Thank you, Josh. That was great. And I have a first question to start off, and this is paraphrasing a couple of viewer questions. You know, in most predator prey or most prey population scenarios, even without a predator, if a prey population gets to a certain density, they sort of eat themselves out of house and home, like herbivores, like, you know, this could be, say, rabbits in terrestrial ecosystems or deer. They will start to suffer starvation and disease, and their population will crash. Could you, Scott alluded to this a little bit in his presentation, but why is it that urchins can exist in this high density, stable state without and persist over time?
Yeah, so this is a great question for Scott, so I hope that I can do it justice. But it seems that urchins are they can adapt really quickly, and they can graze on other things. There's been some studies that have shown that they can actually sequester nutrients out of the water. Like I showed earlier, they scrape the reefs, they find other sources, they even will eat invertebrates that are on the reef. And so, the other important thing too here is that urchins can really slow down their metabolic rate. So in these barrens, the urchins can pretty much shut down, and it doesn't take much to just support their survival. And then when kelp kind of reappears, they can switch again and they can really start actively grazing. And so I think that the contrast in high quality urchins with lots of gonads in forest and starved urchins in barrens kind of gets at that a little bit. So in the barrens, the urchins, they're like, hey, I'm not going to worry about reproduction because I just got to focus on survival. And in order to survive, it really doesn't take much to support that.
Gotcha. And they can live a long time.
And they can live a long time, right?
Okay. Let's see. I have a question from James. Can you speak to the temporal disconnect between urchin increases and sea star declines in Monterey? What caused the urchin increase?
So that temporal period, right? It's kind of like what came first. Was it the urchin outbreak, or the loss of kelp, or the loss of sea stars? It happened so quickly. So our dive surveys, or annual surveys, we do those once a year, and it seemed like when all of these events took place, it was kind of like bam, bam, one after, almost coinciding with each other. And so it's kind of difficult to get at kind of what came first and led up to another. But, this, like others have said, kind of this perfect storm of events, I think really captures what happened here. My kind of take on this is that I think the sea star die-off kind of coincided with this shift in urchin behavior and also perhaps an urchin recruitment event. And coinciding with that, or shortly thereafter, we experienced this really warm water. And at that time, kelp just could not recover. So it was kind of this sequence of events that occurred over such a small temporal time period that, again, it's really hard to kind of tease those things apart.
Gotcha. Now, this next question is a sort of combination of a couple folks' questions, and it has to do with how feasible would it be to increase sort of culling or human take of urchins in the barrens areas. And one viewer mentions maybe a source of fertilizer. I know there's been some talk of taking urchins in Oregon purple urchins out of barrens and trying to put them into aquaculture to get them to a state where they could actually produce uni. Any talk of that in California or anything you know about that?
Yeah, so here, all of the data and the results that I showed during my talk are all inside of marine protected areas. So in California, that means that efforts to go and remove urchins in those places are probably unlikely from a human kind of intervention perspective. However, there have been some pilot studies in other places in the state looking to see the effectiveness of urchin culling and also the feasibility, because urchin culling is certainly a large undertaking. It's not something that you just go out and do one time. It really takes mobilizing a lot of people, and oftentimes it's not something you can just do in a year. It has to be done year after year.
Great. And next question from Lillian is there any indication that colonization of an area by bull kelp facilitates actually facilitates subsequent colonization by giant kelp, or is it just competition both ways?
Right. So that's a really interesting question that we are looking at. So we've been continuing these surveys. The results I showed go up through last year through 2019, and so now the question is what's going on out there this year and next year, and we really hope to get at some of those questions. Is it facilitation, or is it truly competition? So stay tuned.
Okay. A question from Andy. Can you please expand on the relationship between the rock crabs or Dungeness and urchins? There was one slide that teased that content.
Yeah, so our lab has been doing a lot of research looking at the role of rock crabs. So when this urchin outbreak first hit, we dove into the literature and we're like, who are the other urchin predators? And we identified several of those, and we ran several lab experiments to see if a number like 8 to 12 different mesopredators are really effective at consuming a large number of urchins. So we tried some different species of sea stars that we currently have, some other fish and perch, and we included rock crab. And what we arrived at was like, whoa, rock crabs will pound sea urchins. And I have a former student who's now working on her dissertation at Oregon State, Cheyenne Jarman, who did a lot of work looking at do rock crabs have a preference for healthier starved urchins like sea otters do, and also, you know, how many urchins do they actually eat? And the bottom line is that we found that rock crabs just eat everything. It seemed initially like there was no preference, but we're still running more experiments to see if there's something there. And so we're continuing to look at the role of rock crabs as a sea urchin predator in the system.
Okay, one last question here, or possibly the last question. This is from Dave. Do sea lions hunt or compete with sea otters? Mainly wondering how Oregon sea lions might interact with introduced otters.
Yeah, so this question is probably outside of my wheelhouse. There'll be other speakers in other sessions who can probably give a better answer. I'm just not as knowledgeable with sea lions and harbor seals and other mammals, but I think that there is some overlap in their diets. But you know, sea lions are certainly not out there eating urchins. It's the otters, and so. Yeah, perhaps later on there'll be an opportunity to present that question again.
Okay, yeah, and so I got another one for you here. Since we have a couple minutes, whether it's people harvesting urchins or sea otters, do you know if there's any way to discern, or do otters tend to know if it's a full urchin with uni before cracking it open, or or is that like maybe even urchin divers can tell that? Do you know if there's any selection going on there before otters crack an urchin open?
Right. So they can't detect it underwater. So what they do, and we've seen this, is when we track them foraging along the coastline, they'll kind of do this cookie crumb trail, making a single dive in different places where they're testing the area. And they'll bring up an urchin and crack it open at the surface. And if it's empty, then they just move on. But then when they hit a patch of healthy urchins in a forest, they rapidly deplete that patch of urchins.
Gotcha. Well, fascinating. Well, thanks so much for that. Was a great presentation, and I will turn it over to Bob.
Okay, let's go back here. Thanks so much, Josh, and thanks to Sarah, thanks to Scott, and thank you everybody for watching. We had about 130 to 160 people on today, and that's a pretty darn good audience. So for those of you returning this evening, for Jim Estes and his keynote talk will be on just shortly before 7 o'clock, and we'll start promptly with Jim at 7. In the meantime, I want to thank the speakers again, our panelists that are going to be here tomorrow and the next day, and for all of you for participating. It's been an interesting afternoon, and now comes Miller time. So we'll see you later tonight.
Bye, everyone.